get a chance to do this too for the people who are absent. But on the research project number 1, on this slide, I attached a presentation that I already talked to you about. But as I was looking over what you submitted to me already, one of the things that I was noticing is that sometimes people skipped images altogether, or they haven't gotten there yet, or maybe they could find some better stuff. And so I had shown this to you before, and I thought I would sit here today just to kind of help you out. But when you're talking about like context of like how the work reflects the time in which it was made, you know, you could have portraits of Trajan, right? You could have portraits of Maya Lin. You could have historical photos from Vietnam, the Vietnam War, right? You could have timelines, dates, maps. Those things really help to understand how it relates to the time in which it was made, okay? And then media. We have 2 different kinds of medias, obviously. And so a lot of times things like the raw materials, the process, diagrams on how it was made will help explain some of the information that you had. Describing the style, close-ups work really well for that, especially on the column of Trajan. If you can show a close-up style, a close-up of it, and explain how it's Roman style, maybe compare it to something Greek, or even just defining how it's Roman style based on the visual evidence, that will help a lot. When you think about function and purpose and how it tells a story, whole images and then close-up might help to explain the parts. So if you're like thinking about the column, like what's the top, the like 1 scene or 2 scenes, and then like a base, like what are those details? That really does help you with the function, because there's multiple functions of the column of Trajan. If you came up with one, you're kind of missing out on a couple of things, okay? Placement and location, diagrams. We're going to look at the column of Trajan today. I won't go into a lot of the nitty gritty because I know you already have, but if you have diagrams and you think about where that column was placed or where that memorial was placed, it helps you understand the meaning a little bit better. And then the last part is placement of the viewer to the work. So when I go visit Washington, D.C., how am I supposed to experience the Vietnam War Memorial, right? So thinking about that, if you can get images of people interacting with it, you're going to get a deeper understanding of the meaning. And I know some of us talked about how we've been there before, and if you can find photos from that trip, that might be great too, to understand how intimate that setting really is. Okay, it's very different than the column of Trajan, and we'll see a little bit of that today. Is there any questions on that? Keep in mind that if you have nice images and you have a lot of info, you can put them on multiple slides. You can put them on multiple slides. It doesn't all have to fit on a slide. It should be full of clarity, so we should be able to understand what you're talking about. So questions on that? If you think of one as I'm getting the presentation set up for finishing up the Pantheon, let me know. Anything? You guys good? Okay. If you come up with a question as you're working, feel free to shoot me an email. Doesn't mean I'll get back to you right away, or shoot me a remind. Doesn't mean I'll be able to get back to you right away, but I can get back to you quickly, as long as it's not in the middle of the night. Let's go ahead and finish up looking at Roman temple architecture, focusing on functionalism and symbolism. So last Friday, which seems like a long, long time ago, we were at the Pantheon. You guys remember, what number is the Pantheon? It's in the 40s, right? 46, thank you. So go ahead and go to 46. And if you remember, we talked about how you're supposed to experience the Pantheon. So you would have stood in front of it and you've been in a courtyard, and you really would only see a typical Greek structure, right? It would look very Greek. You'd have a pediment, you'd have these colossal granite columns, and then you'd walk into the dome, right? You'd walk into that rotunda and you see this infinite space. What is that? What is the function of all that infinite space? Does anyone remember? I know this was a long time ago. We've had so much fun since with homecoming. You guys remember what some of the functions of the Pantheon are? Yeah.
Well, so there was like, it was originally built as like kind of like a temple, like it was meant for like the gods, and then eventually it was made into like the church, and now it's like basically just a tourist location.
Right. So Pantheon, pan means God. And so it was a temple to all of the gods. It was a temple to all the gods. And luckily, it was converted into a Christian church. If it hadn't been turned into a Christian church, it might have been torn apart and used for other things. It was actually torn apart. Parts of it were taken, like the copper ceiling or the bronze ceiling, I should say, was probably taken down. But a lot of it is still in its original condition today. Okay, so it was a temple to the gods. Another major function of it is it works as a sundial. So there is an oculus, and we'll define that in a little bit when we talk about the content of it. There is a big opening on the ceiling, and that ceiling lets in light, and the light moves throughout the day. So when you're standing in there, it's like a dark space, but it has this light that comes in. And at different times of the year, it lights up different portions of the temple. So like as you're in there, you see the passage of time because that light changes and moves according to the sun, right? You see the light shining in, changing shape, changing angle, changing direction. But according to their religious calendar, it also, notice here, is lighting up the entryway. And then it would light up these different niches that house images of the gods. And we'll pinpoint those in a second too. So one way it does it is it's a marker of time. It is a calendar, right? It also, like we said, is a temple to the gods. It's not a home for the gods. It's not where the gods lived. It's just a temple to them. It honors them, right? And so each of these little niches would have had images of gods and rulers. Another thing that people think is that it was a dynastic sanctuary. What do I mean by that? This was located by a sanctuary to Augustus, the first emperor. And so they think that it's possible that this site was located and was strategically placed to kind of show his importance, right? And the importance of Julius Caesar. The site was extremely important. According to the lore, it's part of the story of Romulus, the mythic founder of Rome as well. It's the place of his raising up to the heavens, right? He ascended into heaven. It also aligns to where Augustus was buried. So it would be, once again, kind of connecting Trajan, right, who built this, to a previous ruler, a previous great ruler in Augustus. So big one would be temple to gods, right, sundial, and then its connection to earlier rulers. Because we have that with Agrippa in the name on the front. And we didn't really talk about the front decoration very much. Let's see if I can go back here. We think in the pediment, there was probably a giant eagle. And an eagle was a symbol of ancient Rome. It could have been there in bronze. It could have been there in stone. There are some little holes where they think it was anchored into the pediment. And so it would be a symbol of Rome as well as to the gods, right? So keeping in mind that a lot of the structures also have the essence of propaganda, always related to the state, related to the empire. Right? So the interior was extremely important. Remember that the Greeks emphasized the exterior structures. You know, that's where this religious ceremony took place. In Rome, the interior was emphasized, right? Was emphasized. And so with this image, this is like an illustration from the 1800s, I believe. This is really just to kind of show you how the oculus was used to illuminate the interior. Okay, so here you can see from the top that it is a perfect circle. There is no glass. It does rain. The light shines through the interior. Right? And then thinking about how the decoration is unique, right? When I'm talking about decoration, I'm talking about the surface of it, not necessarily, you know, the how it's built, right? I'm talking about the surface. What's some of the repeating motifs that you see? Go ahead and chit chat with your neighbors. What are some of the repeating motifs? What kind of decoration do you see on the interior? Catherine, feel free to join in with another group if you like. Okay, what are some of the decoration that we see? What's some of the decoration that we see? Anyone want to volunteer what we talked about? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
There's like a lot of circles where
Mhm. Mhm. So we'll start with the columns. Those columns are really there just for decorative purposes. As we saw in the video, and we'll talk about the construction of this, it's made out of concrete and brick. So it really is purely decorative there. It doesn't really hold up that heavy ceiling. And then you were mentioning the squares and the circles. Notice that they are really everywhere. You see them in the marble floor, right? With that orangey yellow color in a square form. We have gray marble, we've got white marble, we've got that red border. A perfect square is a perfect circle. And when you look at the walls of the Pantheon, especially in the first level, notice that the circle square motif continues in the decoration above the images of the gods. Or in this point now, these are Christian saints and martyrs and biblical characters, right? But back in the day, they would have been the different images of the gods, okay? And so here is a recreation of what it would probably have looked like in its own day. So you can have an idea of how these niches would be filled with these decorative images of the gods. And then of course, kind of that repetitive pattern of the floor and then on the first story, okay? So the content of it, like thinking about the parts of the architecture. So in architecture, when we think about content, we're not necessarily thinking about meaning, we're thinking about just like the different parts of the structure. It has an oculus, so you should know the definitions for these different parts. That is the circular opening that lets in the light. Okay, that's the thing that helps mark the time at the top. And then the coifers, those are those rectangular or squared sections at the top. They're basically sunken in panels. This is a motif we will see again in interiors of churches. Okay, we'll see this in interiors of churches. You can see it in the niches here as well. And then Nicole was mentioning crosses. Of course, in its own day, it wouldn't have had crosses, but that was a remodel during Christian purposes. But you can see how they use that coifred ceiling motif even in the niches. And that's something we'll see a lot in different churches, okay? Now the coifers have a couple of purposes to them, okay? The ceiling is made out of concrete. It would have been faced with bronze. So it would have been a dome of heaven. It would have been covered in metal. Okay, it would have been very, very beautiful, but very, very heavy. Okay, so the coifers alleviate some of the weight, right? It's taking out space, it's cutting into the wall. But structurally, it's still very sound. Okay, so it's these kind of sunken in patterns. It also is there decoratively, right? Because notice how those squares get smaller and smaller and pull your eye up to the oculus. They would create an even more dramatic illusion of a vastness of space. And then those coifers are in a dome. And so with the invention of the arch by the Etruscans and the utilization of it by the Romans, you were able to take an arch and make it into a barrel vault or a groin vault. But also, if you put it in a circular motion or circular pattern, like 180, you could also make a dome, right? So a circular dome. And this is a hemispherical dome. It fits into a perfect sphere on the interior, right? So this is quite a unique structure, right? So here you can get a kind of an idea of how innovative the construction is. Notice how thick the base walls are. I believe that drum is like 14 feet thick. 14 feet, it's very, very thick. And so it would have been made out of a very strong concrete. And then on the outside, it was covered in brickwork. And those are the ones that were stamped that tells us, oh, it was from the time of Hadrian, okay? And then the ceiling, as the concrete gets closer and closer to the oculus, the concrete gets thinner. Also, the makeup of the concrete is lighter. So they would mix different ratios of the raw material. They use things like pumice. Has anyone ever used pumice stone to like scratch dead skin off of their feet or anything like that? It's a very lightweight volcanic stone, and they used it in the concrete to make that ceiling lighter, so that it wouldn't fall and wouldn't collapse. Because even though an arch is very structurally sound, it still would have been incredibly heavy based on the scale of it, and that it was covered in bronze probably. And then also they mentioned in the video, it probably had little flower rosette shapes or stars in the ceiling as well. And it would be kind of the emphasis of it being a dome of heaven. Right? So here is kind of the base of the different kinds of structure that they use in the concrete. So at the very base of it, it's faced in travertine. It's kind of like a marble. And then they would use travertine and tufa. Remember the tufa, that volcanic stone that they used in the Etruscan tombs. Then they use tufa and brick. Then they use just brick. And then they use pumice. So they would ground that up into the concrete to make the materials lighter. Okay. Now, we're not going to do this because of COVID, but one of the things that I often like to do is just a little bit of physics. And so when we think about construction, right, we have post and lintel. Post and lintel is pretty strong, but it's not as strong as an arch. So if you were to take like somebody's elbow and try to break through this, like if I'm forming my hand like this, my hand would fall quite fast. If I just use a little bit of a rounded arch, right, and try to do the same thing, you'd find there's a lot more resistance, right? Because with the physics of it, it's forcing the weight down rather than weight out, and it just holds a lot better. We'll find that in the Gothic period, when they switch it to a pointed arch, it even becomes more structurally sound. Okay. I don't really want to watch this completely, but I am going to I want you to get a grasp of how big this interior space is. This is art of the Western world, and it has a little bit of review. This is from like the 80s. You can kind of see from this guy's mustache here. But I want to show you how big this interior space is. I think I'm going to have to pause, of course, the video here. Okay. So let's go ahead and move away from temple construction. And we're going to look at some images of power and death. Just exciting that so we're looking at High Roman Empire and Late Roman Empire here. Okay, so Hadrian. Hadrian is the emperor where the territory of Rome had expanded to its largest borders. And so he was able to take his troops all the way up into the British Isles, and he was at the border of Scotland. That's where we have that wall that we saw the other day. And you can see that he had gotten much of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. And so after his death, that's when we start to see a shrinkage of the vastness of the size of the emperor, or the empire, I should say, right? One of the things that he did to show off his wealth and his expansion of the territories is that he recreated some of his very favorite spots in Rome. And so this is Tivoli. This is Hadrian's estate. And on his estate, he brought some of the gardens of Alexandria from Egypt. He recreated it and put it in his estate on the outskirts of Rome. So you can see, Roman, Greek inspired sculptures, and then this idea of a colonnade around a reflection pond, right? Those are the walls we talked about before in Scotland, right? And after Hadrian, that's when we have Trajan. And so in our image set, we have 4 images from Trajan, right? Or the Forum of Trajan. Our column is one of them, okay? So when you see this handout here, how many pages of that did I print? Did I print a few pages of that one or just one? Just 2. Just 2? So there's 2 of them? Okay. What I would probably do is focus on the building, right? The building for one of those. And then the other one, maybe just the column itself, right? And there's actually, we've got the forum itself, and then we have some market images too. I should have printed at least 3 pages of that. But the markets, we won't have a lot of information on either, okay? So when we look at this scene, this is a courtyard scene of the forum. This right here is the basilica, and this is an interior image of what we think the basilica looked like, okay? We know the architect for this, and I know some of you put that in your research, Apollodorus of Damascus, and so we have a Greek architect here. So we have the forum and the markets. So this is what it looks like today. It really is reduced to rubble. Probably the best preserved parts of it are the market and the column itself. This image that you see back here is a monument to Victor Emmanuel, who was one of the first presidents of Italy. That is a recreation of a Greek temple. It is propaganda from early 1900s, right? So I just want to make sure you understand that this is not original. This is pretty much original, other than that little guy at the top, right? So this is the plan of the forum. So we talked about the forum already when we were looking at the early empire. Remember that this is in the valley in between Palatine Hill, where the emperors live, and Capitoline Hill, which is where the major temple to the god is. Okay, so this is in the valley. One of the things that you notice is this is the Forum of Trajan, okay? But right next door to it, we have the Forum of Julius Caesar. We have the Forum of Augustus. Why would he put his forum next to Augustus and Julius Caesar? Why would Trajan do that? Yeah. Right. He wanted to exert his power and to show his connection with the first great rulers of the empire. Okay. Julius Caesar had gained control that allowed Augustus to become the first emperor. Remember, before that, it was the Republic, it was a committee of people ruling. Here we had one centralized power. So Trajan put himself right next to these great leaders. And remember that during the time of Augustus, we have that time of Pax Romana. This was a time of peace, right? So he's connecting himself with this time of peace as well, right? One of the other things that you'll notice is how big his forum is compared to these earlier rulers. Notice how small the forum of Augustus is, how small the forum of Julius Caesar. This, right, this whole thing here is the Forum of Trajan. It's quite large. Okay, now we will get there eventually. This is the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine, right? So this is kind of like the downfall of the city of Rome. And notice how large this basilica is compared to how small that one is, right? And so things kind of get bigger and grandiose at the end as well. Okay, so the plan, and this would be in connection with this image that you have here and the image set. Okay, the different parts of it. If you were to like enter in to the forum, okay, you would open into a courtyard. So it would be kind of like fortified courtyard. And then the very center of it would be an equestrian statue of Trajan. So we have Trajan on a horse, probably made in bronze, showing him as a powerful military commander, okay? And then you would enter into the Basilica of Ulpia. That is his family name, We will see what that looks like on the interior in just a second. Now, next to this building is where we have the Column of Trajan. So the Column of Trajan was outside this building, right smack dab in the middle of two libraries, okay? So he had a Greek and a Latin library placed in his forum. Why would he want a library? When did the library show up? Yeah. Exactly. He's so wise, right? He brought great books from the empire, right? Different lands of the empire, and brought them to his forum. And then in that last little niche that we have here, upon his death, he had a temple built, the Temple of Divine Trajan. So remember that once a emperor dies, they become gods. And so he had in his own lifetime a temple built for him so that he could be honored for the rest of his being and then into eternity. Now, next to the whole forum, we also have the markets of Trajan. So this area over here is his markets. So that's kind of like on the outskirts of it. Okay, so here you can see it from an aerial view of what all of that would look like. Okay, so the basilica is on one end of this courtyard. This open atrium, this open space right here would be open for people to gather, and it would have housed this equestrian monument, okay? So this is just a little info on this particular context photo that they incorporated for us. Okay, this is inside the basilica. Okay, so a basilica is a secular building. Okay, it is a secular building. It had many different purposes for it. It was a gathering hall for people. It's a training facility for the soldiers. It would have a very large open space in the inside of it, right? It would have side aisles for people to kind of walk through the areas of the structure. It would have two apses or two niches on the side, and there probably would have been maybe a seated monument to Trajan on one of these ends as well. And then the other side, he could have sat when he was at the forum and kind of had people kind of come up to him, right? So he would have been there the Mondays, I got a case of the Mondays, I'm trying to think of like hold court in a way, almost like he was a king, right? So he'd be sitting there and people would come up and he could sit kind of enthroned and be able to do business. So it has a lot of functionality to this structure. It's not a temple, right? And it's not necessarily a place of government, but it did serve some political function to it. Now, one thing you'll notice is that it has a second story to it. Not that you necessarily see people walking up here. And then if you look out the columns, what can I see? What's this? The column of Trajan, right? Notice that the ceiling is a flat ceiling, but it has the coifers that we saw at the Pantheon. So this is a very common motif to make the ceiling lighter, right? But also decorative. Okay. So it had various civic functions. I forgot it also could be judicial as well. Now, one of the reasons that they include this image in the image set, because the Basilica of Mexico isn't really in existence anymore, we really just have a few columns of it and whatnot, is that when we look at Christianity, we look at early Christian art starting next week or starting Friday, we actually have a church that's based on the design of a basilica, okay? Because Christians would want to borrow from, I mean, they were Roman too, they borrowed from Roman construction, but instead of borrowing temple construction, which would be paganism and a different religion, they picked secular construction to use to make their churches, which was kind of nice because then they had naves and they could lead you to an altar area. Notice how this apse is the same shape, right, as where the altar would be in the church. You could have pomp and circumstance here. You could have people seated here. It was kind of a perfect format for a church service, right? And so they will adopt this basilica format for these early church construction, as well as later, right? Now, the next thing that we have is our markets. So the markets, when this forum was being built, he had to destroy part of the current markets that had already existed. And he kind of learned from Nero, right? Remember horrible Nero? That you don't really want to make people unhappy. So instead, he built bigger and better markets for the people of Rome. And so it's made out of brick because, of course, things like the Great Fire of Rome led them to believe that they should be building things out of concrete or brick because it does not catch fire like wood construction. So this is made out of that concrete and brick. The first stories are often offices, and those most important offices would have been on the ground level, connected to the forum. And they often had things like connected with the imperial treasury. And then as they went up, we'd have lesser officials. And some of these markets were connected to the government. So like grain distribution, right? Sort of like how in the US government, we have a Department of Agriculture, okay? So there was some political connection here too, but also it did serve as a typical market for people. So you could have gone here and bought the things that you would need, right? The things that you would need. So clothes, like fabric, different food options, things you would need in your house. And so it was kind of like a shopping mall today. There was different stories. It had large openings so that you could see the merchandise. You could go in. There would be different ways to get to the second story and so on. And notice that it's made out of brick, but they're also using vaulting, right? They're using those rounded arches. So here is kind of walking through the forum, or excuse me, the market, get an idea of how organized it is. Even air conditioned. Wow, ancient Rome had air conditioning. And then we have our column of Trajan as well. So you probably have a lot of research on this, so I don't really want to spend too much time on it. But keeping in mind that it has multiple functions of it, right? It had multiple functions. Now, a lot of you have talked about the Dacians and the idea of what that represents on the column, but what's the base for? What's the base for? Does anyone know? Yeah. Right. So there was a tomb for Hadrian or Trajan's ashes in the base. So there would have been an urn there that housed his ashes. So it's also a marker of his death, right? And then at the very top, it would have been an image of Trajan. But of course, today it's not. Who was placed on top of it? St. Peter. The Christians converted it into a Christian monument for Christianity. And so now there's an image of the first pope, one of the followers of Jesus, on the very top of it. And they have not taken it down, which I find kind of interesting. So here's like some of the close-ups from the textbook. Okay. So let's go ahead and get a little introduction to Petra. See if it works here. This is my first introduction to Petra from my childhood. Oh, I probably need to pause this. Okay, so what we're going to do right now is just take a little break from the Romans, and we're going to look at the Nabateans. This is a culture that's kind of like we have two images from it, and there's nothing else really. It's, you know, I could have put it in Near Eastern art, but I like to put it after Rome because the Romans conquered it under Trajan, which we just talked about, right? And it does have some connection with Roman architecture as well as Greek architecture. So I like to house it here. It's in modern day Jordan today. Okay. The Nabateans were incense traders. They were quite wealthy in their own day. Okay. Now we'll stop here, but just like the video that we saw from Indiana Jones showed, is that this city is built in a canyon ravine. So it's basically in slot canyon. It's in a slot canyon, or at least getting there. And the sixth is an entrance into Petra. It's this really, really narrow canyon that has a road at the base. And its most important or most famous building, called the Treasury, is the one that we see coming through that thin slit right there. Okay, we'll focus on the rest of its construction tomorrow. Okay, so for tomorrow, we'll finish up ancient Rome. Like I said, we will have some time tomorrow to finish that. If we need more time on Wednesday, we can do that too. Wednesday, I'll have some time for you to answer questions or ask questions on the research assignment if you have anything. And then I also have some review things that we can do to get ready for our quiz on Thursday.